When starting a new hobby, we typically have to start from a beginner level, and what you see on this table is an example of a beginner fix. Now, this trimmer was last seen on this channel about 4 years ago, and even though I only performed minor work to it, it now needs a lot more work because, as you might have guessed it, it's going to go away to a better place. Now, hopefully I don't find any other serious issues with it, otherwise it'll be here for a lot longer than I ever expected. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this bright orange trimmer, and the problem is that it's hard to start, and if it does happen to start, it won't stay running. So my intentions for this trimmer is that I'm going to sell it, so I need to go through it and find out why it's having the issues it's having, fix it, and make sure it's going to work well for the next person who owns it. Oh, and if you're wondering why I'm not naming this brand out loud, I'm doing it on purpose, but why? Well, if I were you, I'd look through the comments and you'll understand why. Now, I'm going to try and repair this trimmer, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. I don't know how many times I've been asked what my thoughts are about this brand, and even though I tell everyone that I really like them, I would never ever own one. And the reason why is because I do not feel comfortable using it, and if you want a better reason why, I really don't have a better one, and to be honest, I think my reasoning is completely valid. So here's the thing, just because I find it awkward to use doesn't mean you'll feel the same way about it, so you may like it and find it to be the best trimmer you've ever used. And if that's the case for you, then that's great news, but as for me, I already have a brand that I really like to use. Now the funniest part is that most would find the brand that I like to use to be a complete joke and possibly even a troll to this entire hobby, but I assure you the reason I use the brand that I do is because it's comfortable and easy to use. So it looks like the fuel filter has come off the line in the tank, which means there's a good chance that the inlet screen inside the carb might be clogged since the filter wasn't able to do its job. But before we do that, we need to make sure that this engine will start and run after I physically prime it with some fuel. So fortunately the engine started and ran for a few seconds on the fuel I put into it, which I already knew it would. However, if I'd never heard this trimmer run before, this would at least confirm that spending any time and more importantly money on this repair would have been worth it. But what if it didn't start and run? What then? Now if that happened, the first thing I would check for is spark by using a spark checker. And if I saw that it did have spark, I would then check to make sure that the engine was not worn out by using a compression tester. So what if it had plenty of spark and a good compression reading well over 90 psi and it still won't start? What then? So what happens when you try to start a two-stroke machine and it doesn't start is that the fuel that's not burned will stay in the machine and basically flood the engine. So when there's too much fuel in the engine, it's very unlikely to start and run because the air-fuel mixture will not have enough oxygen to ignite the mixture and you'll need to clear the flood. So here's a tip for you. If you need to figure out which port on the carb is the fuel return and which one is for the filter, all you need to do is listen to the sounds it's making. What you need to do is to press on the bulb several times and see which port is making noises. To do that, all you have to do is put your finger on either port and see which one stops making noises. Now with my finger on the lower port, you can still hear sounds while pressing the bulb, but if you cover the top port and press the bulb, the sound goes away. What this tells me is that the top port is making the sounds. That means the top port is for the return line, and of course the bottom port is meant for the filter line. Of course, this may not work for every carb, but it certainly works for this one. Now I do want to say something about these expensive pink colored fuel lines. I thought because they were expensive they would be resistant to ethanol and rich gasoline, but as you can see they've become hard, which they're not supposed to be. Now I got these lines from my local hardware store, and back then I wanted to use them on this machine, that way I wouldn't have to change them for a long time, but as you can tell, even with minimal use, the lines still hardened. So I've come to the realization that these lines are not supposed to last forever, whether it's $1 a foot or $3 a foot, and at some point, whether a handful of years or 10 years later, they're going to eventually fail and you will need to repair them again. Now the fuel line that I'm going to be using is sized at 3/16 of an inch, and it's supposed to be somewhat ethanol resistant, but only time will tell, and unless you want to buy some really expensive fuel line, just get ready to do this job again sometime in the future. Of course, more than likely, I'm going to get the occasional comment from a viewer saying that their trimmer has had the same fuel lines on it for the last 15 to 20 years. And if that is you, then that's fantastic. It just means that you chose a really great machine, but for the rest of us, well, we got what we paid for. Now, I find that if I run the filter line first and also put it into the opening that's the furthest away from the tank opening, it's a lot easier to install, but you can do it however you want. Of course, you don't have to do it the way that I show it, but seeing how I do it might make it a lot easier to install, especially if you've never done it before. Now, just make sure that you leave enough fuel line in the tank so that the filter has the ability to reach the front part of the fuel tank. Doing it this way allows all the fuel to be picked up by the filter, and you won't have to stop to refuel as often. After that's done, I'll then use the same method to install the fuel return line. Now, this line does not have to be very long, but I would recommend that at least 1 inch of it extends into the tank. That way it'll be very unlikely to fall out later on. Also, having some bent pliers like this one makes this job a whole lot easier, and the best part is these are not very expensive at all, so they're worth every single penny. Now that the fuel lines have been replaced, I'll start to work on the carb. The first thing that I want to check is whether the inlet screen is clogged with debris. But as you can see, there's no debris on it, which is obviously really good news. However, if yours is clogged with debris, you'll need to clean the screen the best you can. Next, I need to check that the metering diaphragm is in good working condition, and to do that, I'll need to remove this metal plate. So here is the diaphragm, and its only job is to control fuel flow through the carb, but it needs to be extremely flexible to do that. However, this one seems to be a bit stiff, but to get a better feel for it, I need to remove it from this metal plate as well as remove the gasket that's stuck to it. But even without taking off the gasket, I can tell that this diaphragm has lost a lot of its flexibility and is in no shape to work at least well enough to control fuel flow. On top of everything else, it has a few wrinkles in it which might also get in the way of it working like it's supposed to. Now, I could just throw this one away, but since it's not completely petrified, I'm going to throw it into my rejuvenation bath on the off chance that I might be able to use it later on in a future project. After that, the last thing I need to do is to confirm that fuel will flow through the screen after filling it and then pressing on the rocker arm. Now, the fuel should basically disappear through the screen and make it past the needle in a very short time. However, if yours does not disappear or it's very slow to disappear, then you'll need to remove the needle and rocker arm. That way you can safely clean the screen with carb cleaner. However, since ours disappeared very quickly through the screen, it means we're good to go to put this carb back together. Now, if you couldn't tell, the new metering diaphragm I just installed is extremely flexible. In fact, it's at least twice as flexible as the one I took out. That's how flexible it needs to be to work the rocker arm correctly. So what would have happened if I had reused that old diaphragm then? Simple. You might have been able to start the machine, but it might have been really tough to keep running. Or you might be able to keep it running, but when you squeeze the trigger, the machine will have a tough time running or getting to full speed. Basically, you're going to have some starting or running issues that you won't be able to fix even if you're able to tune the carb to the best of your abilities. But I do want to offer you one alternative though. If you want to take the challenge of cleaning and servicing one of these carbs, then try it out. But if you want to make it easier on yourself, then just order a brand new carb instead. You're going to save yourself a lot of time and maybe even avoid a headache or two, especially if you end up with an issue and you find yourself doing the same cleaning more than once. Now, once the fuel lines have been connected to the carb, we'll need to check that the fuel is flowing through the lines like they're supposed to, otherwise the engine might not start. After adding some fuel to the tank, I'll leave the fuel cap off and then press the bulb a few times. So when pressing the purge bulb, fuel should come up the filter line and then go through the carb and then partially fill the bulb. After that, it should then leave the carb and go through the return line and go back to the fuel tank. So only after a few presses on the bulb, we already have fuel filling it, which is great news. Now, if yours is not filling with fuel, then you might have a carb issue, or there might be something wrong with the fuel lines or the fuel filter. Either way, you'll need to check them, and if they're all good, then the carb might be the issue. Now that we know that fuel is flowing correctly through the system, I'll then finish the installation of the airbox, the filter, and its cover. Then I'll replace the fuel cap on the tank, and then we can finally try starting it. Now, if we do have any issues trying to start this machine, we'll have to make a few turns on the fuel adjustment screws, but hopefully we won't have to do that. Now, just to let you know that even when you get a new carb, you might still have to make a few adjustments on it, only because the engine might be worn to a point that a stock carb may not work right out of the box. So it looks like it started right up with no issues at all, which makes my job a whole lot easier. The best part though was that I'm very happy with how the engine revs and idles, so I'm going to leave the fuel settings right where they're at. However, this could have gone a whole lot worse. Starting a machine right after repairing the carb sometimes results in a hard starting situation, and when you do finally get it started, the settings might have to be adjusted multiple times until it can cold start and also run well at wide open throttle. Then after all that, you still have to let it cool down and make sure it works the next day just the same way as the day before. Like I said before, this process could have very easily been a lot tougher, so I was very lucky with how this one turned out. There's no shame in just ordering a new carb. In fact, I've had to do it plenty of times on occasions when I don't get the carb cleaned out well enough to work the way it should. I would always recommend that you at least try and take the carb apart just so you can inspect it, and then when you realize that it's a lot worse than you think it is, just order a new carb. I will say one thing though, I really do like this brand of trimmer, and maybe it's just that I haven't found the right model that fits me. However, I've had the opportunity to work on several other models from this brand, curved or straight shaft, new and old, and I simply don't like using them. So my question is, would you ever buy something that you didn't feel comfortable using, or worse yet, could you recommend it to other people knowing that you would never get one yourself? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.